Welcome back to Asking for Knowledge. This is episode 15. And on today's episode, we are going to start a discussion on failure. So, as I often do, I get into a topic and realize there is way too much to cover in a reasonable time frame. So, to keep these from being an hour or much longer, we're going to try to break them up. So, this will just be starting the discussion. But if this is your first time listening, I'm your host, Jeff Mabe. We have 3 different episode types. So we have Asking Out Loud, which is our most common episode, which is me on here, sharing ideas, sharing thoughts, presenting questions that you can ask of yourself, questions that I ask of myself, and things that I run into as a parent, as a coach, as a business owner, as a husband, all the different things that I experience in life. I try to make them relate to baseball, but I think life comes at us a lot more often than baseball does. So with this podcast, the goal is always to get to first principles on baseball. And I think as we often find, or as I'm finding, baseball kind of fades into the distance, and then we end up talking about relationships and growth and, in today's episode, failure and all the things that come along with it. So apologies if you came here for just baseball talk. I would argue that this is baseball talk at its deepest level, but nonetheless, that's where we are. So a couple other episode types: Ask the Experts, which is in development, and then Ask Your Parents, where we share results from surveys, or eventually we're going to bring parents on where they can discuss their experiences. And so anyway, this is where we're at. This is episode 15. There are certainly, if you want to go back and learn more about us, you can certainly go back and do that. But our core focus as an organization is to help kids master the mentality, mechanics, and joy of baseball. And in most cases on this podcast, we end up talking about mentality and we end up talking about joy and kids having fun. So the mechanics part, we typically leave out, and we save that for other areas. But at any rate, today we're talking about kids and failure. And I'd like to start with the question of, have you ever wished your kid would fail? Really think about that for a minute. Have you ever wished they would fail? And I think this is one of those questions that most of the time, on its face, when we're presented with it, just like I've presented it, our natural response is no, absolutely not. Like, why would I ever wish for that? But then I want you to think a little deeper and think about those times where a kid's maybe doing something that's a little careless. Maybe they want to eat a bunch of sugar or drink a bunch of sugary drinks, or maybe they don't want to go to bed, or maybe they're, jumping on something high and are presented with the chance of falling and hurting themselves. Maybe they're playing with I don't know. There's a million scenarios, but think about those as a parent, those times where your kid's doing something that you know in your parental wisdom and experience that it's probably going to lead down a negative path. They're going to get hurt. Maybe their stomach's going to hurt from all the sugar. Maybe they are going to be super grumpy the next day because they don't want to go to bed and they need to get up early. Maybe they, I don't know. There's a lot of scenarios when this happens, and I think there's a good chance that many of us have had those experiences where we just say, hey, just do it your way. Do it your way, and then we see them kind of suffer the consequences, good or bad, for whatever it is that they're doing. And so I look at that and I say, okay, well, how do we respond? So let's say they were playing on something high. We told them they were going to hurt that they stood the risk of falling and they might hurt themselves, and then they fall and they hurt themselves. How do we respond, right, when that happens? I told you, you mess around and you find out. That's a common meme these days. But at any rate, what was our response as parents? I know mine. Question yourself and really think about what yours has been in those circumstances. Now, let's transfer that to the field, the court, the classroom, some other area, do we take the same approach? Are we more inclined to intervene? Do we kind of take that same, just do your thing and find out, right? Or do we treat it differently? And the reason I'm prompting this question is I want you to think about, does the desire for your kid to learn extend to those public domains where they might win, they might lose, they might suffer embarrassment, they might have to deal with real consequences, right? Does it extend to those areas, or is it just those times where we're kind of sitting at home, or we're in other scenarios where it's like nobody's really watching, and so we give them these opportunities to try something and fail? In other words, in one scenario, we want them to learn their lesson. And then in others, we're not quite as motivated for them to learn their lesson. We'd rather it be a softer fall, or maybe they don't experience the failure at all. So we have the insight that sometimes, and we understand that sometimes they need to learn on their own, that they have to experience the consequences of their actions. We have that insight sometimes, but then other times we step in. We help them finish the homework last minute or the assignment last minute, or we, help them avoid failure in some other way. How do we choose between the two? When do we let them learn the lesson, and when do we get involved? And just in case, to jump ahead, if you're kind of sitting and waiting for me to tell you when you should and you shouldn't, you're on the wrong podcast. It's not, I have the knowledge, here it is. That's not the name of the podcast. It's asking for knowledge. So the biggest part of this is me questioning things for myself in an effort to learn and to gain a better experience and to get closer to truth. And so my hope is in me working through this process, you can work through it as well. And so I'm not going to say, hey, this is when you should and you shouldn't, but at least maybe we can prompt some thoughts to get us a little further down the path. So do we allow them to fail in certain scenarios and not others? What drives these decisions? Are we worried about what others will think of your child? Are we worried about what others will think of you? And I'll say most of the time, these are things that they don't happen at the conscious level. So in order to really think about these things, you're going to have to pause for a minute and think about your thinking. And I would say I'm probably an overthinker. I've worked to be quicker, to be more efficient in that, but I do tend to analyze things to a deep level. So I'm not, I'm going to drag you down with me. Let me say it like that. I'll drag you down with me. So again, we're going to have to take in the moment. Most of the time, we're not thinking about these things as we're making these decisions. It's just kind of in the moment, and we're responding to the circumstances that are in front of us. When we either fix or prevent our kids from having problems, is it because we don't want to see them hurt, or are we fixing those problems because of our own egos? Or is it something else? It could be something else entirely. It could be a combination of the two. It could be neither of the two. But I think it boils down to those two a lot of the time. Again, presenting ideas, but it is remarkable the level that we will go to sometimes to gain social approval. As humans, we are social beings, and it's in our nature to crave approval. Again, I'm not going to get into the human history aspect of this, but to be ostracized from the group is just never a good scenario. It hasn't been in our history of being humans, and it's not currently. So being a part of some group benefits us greatly. And so it leads us to be more inclined to gain that social approval. Now, if this is something that you are caught up in or is a constant issue, if you're constantly kind of asking yourself, well, what will people think or what will people say? I'm going to share this little idea I got from a guy named Alex Hormozi. Has some really great stuff on business. But I really thought about this. And this was, I don't know, I'm not real sure when the Queen of England died, but it was maybe a year or two ago. And he was making the point, it had been like a couple weeks after, and he's like, how many times have you thought about the Queen since she passed away? And, of course, the vast majority of people hadn't thought about her once, unless they just happened to see a line in the news or something like that, where it's kind of the follow-up of the funeral, and all the different things that go with it. But like really thinking about the Queen, right? And the chances are close to zero. And so his point was, here's a human that, at least in terms of an international, global reach, was at the absolute top of the top. Virtually everybody in the world would know of the Queen of England, right? In terms of wealth and power and influence, at the very top, right? Yet, after her passing, you haven't thought about her not once, even a week or two later, right? And his point is that we get so wrapped up in our decisions and the effects and what people will think and what people will say, and chances are they're not thinking about us at all. So maybe that's a new paradigm you can use in these scenarios. Maybe that'll help you not get so wound up into what other people think about you. Because if you always run your filter through what other people are going to think, that is an exhausting process to live through. Now, I will throw in there, this is not like a forget the world, I'm going to do me at the expense of everybody else. This is not that. I'm not talking about that approach, okay? I'm just talking about everything you think, do, or say, the way that you treat your children, the things that your children are involved in or not involved in, always worrying about what everybody else is going to say. That's the part I would love to see people set free from. Anyway, so back on topic, little sidebar there. Armed with that framework, let's get back to fixing your kids' problems. So if we're not worried about social approval, how does that affect our decision as to whether or not we let our kids experience failure? So you may still make the same decisions, right? But at least you'll be clear about the whys and the whats. You'll at least be clear when maybe your ego is slipping in and affecting those decisions, and maybe you're worried about perception of you as a parent if you don't do the right things for your kids or make them do the right things, right? I think that gets a lot of parents. The things I should do, the things that other people think I should do, right? So how far do we take this? Do we take a completely hands-off approach in terms of how we let our kids deal with the consequences of failure and their decisions? When do we step in? How do we know where that line is? It's a pretty fine line between being I'll say a loving parent or what many would consider to be a maniac, right? So where is that line? We've talked before on this podcast that in order to develop some characteristics, hardship is a necessity, right? If we want patience, we got to have experiences of having to battle through things and be patient. If we want to be resilient, we have to have something to work through, right? In Christian circles, it's, you don't get a testimony without a test. It's that same idea. And I think all of us understand that in its basic function, but yet when failure happens with our kids, many times we kind of swoop in and save the day. Or we're inclined to. Maybe we don't, but we're much more inclined to. And I would say now more than ever, as a society, we're concerned about trauma, right? And the things that we say to our kids and how it affects their development. And, we have this fear of creating lasting damage by, something that we do or something that we say. And we're really, really concerned about their emotional state. And again, this is, I would say by and large. Now there's still a segment of the population, and I would say that I throw myself into this category sometimes, where it's just kind of like, hey, just suck it up, right? Get over it, kid. This happens. It's part of life. Just, suck it up and move on. And I would say, again, I kind of fall in that camp more often, especially in the early days of being a parent. But as time has gone on, I've been more inclined to kind of explain some of the emotions and the feelings that come along with these different experiences. And again, each person's got to decide for themselves kind of how we deal with that. But, I think there's become an unnecessary fear around the effects of how we deal with our kids. And, I'll just say I've come to believe that you just can't, there's just not a perfect way. Every kid's going to react differently. Every kid's going to respond differently. As they age, they're going to have a different perspective on things. And some are going to say, my parents did it perfectly. And some are going to say, mine were awful. And they're going to be everywhere in between. And so trying to engineer for this outcome where our kids can say we were the perfect parents, I just think it's a losing game. And so I think what we really want our kids to be is what's called anti-fragile. Again, I'm talking through these things myself, but I've heard and read about this book. Nassim Taleb is the author. The name of the book is Anti-Fragile, and that's where this term came from. But his argument in the book is that resilience and robustness and kind of like the toughness approach is not the opposite of being fragile. So I think in our culture, in our development, so many times we talk about toughness, we talk about resilience, we talk about grit and that sort of thing. But he's like, what we really want is anti-fragile. So it's the opposite of being fragile. So if fragile is something that breaks under stress, anti-fragile is something that actually gets better the more stress that is placed upon it. And that's where I think we need to get to. So for our context, in a sports context, this would be a kid that gets more determined after every strikeout or error or bad game or bad weekend or bad season, that somehow through that experience, they become more determined, more driven, if you will, and it makes them better in the long run. Maybe not as a baseball player, right? Because baseball will certainly end at some point, but as a human being, they develop more character, they develop more character skills and strengths that they can utilize and operate on in other areas of their life. So you can take this across all domains. And I think if we really meditate on this, this is what we want for our kids. Is we want because we can't insulate them. We can't insulate them from the world. They're going to experience these hard times. And so I think if we can work towards developing that anti-fragile or anti-fragility ability. Now all of a sudden, these things that they come up against, and they're going to come up against by virtue of being human beings, they're going to be ready for. And it's going to help them grow instead of breaking them down. And, I can't say this with certainty, but I think our worry is that our kids will fold, that they'll lose confidence, that they will get their feelings hurt, and ultimately quit, whatever it is, right? I hear it from parents a lot, we want to build their confidence. And I'm like, I don't necessarily understand that. I get the concept, but I don't understand it entirely. And I think on another level, we have this fear that our kids will get used to failure, that they'll accept it as normal. And, again, to bring it back to baseball, you see this at the end of every season, unfortunately. If a team doesn't win enough, you can count on your top 2 or 3, 4 players. They're gone, period. And they'll either start their own team, the parents, dads, whoever. They'll either start their own team or they'll join another team that, is already maybe their top 3 or 4 players. And then, now all of a sudden we're not going to lose very much because we just took the best off of both teams and made a super team, more or less. Actually, I've been through this experience where, the parents came at the end of the season and were like, hey, we're not winning enough. We don't want our kids to get used to losing. And so if you don't cut players, we're out of here. And, the team broke apart as a result. But the justification was that they didn't want their children to get used to losing. I will not spend any time in this podcast talking about that. But the question is, does this thought process make our kids fragile or anti-fragile? If we insist on constructing a winning team, does that mean our children are more likely to turn out winners? I don't believe it does. And here's why. Because under those circumstances, you are manipulating the variables for the child. So you're pulling them off the team, you're putting them on a different team. And so you are the key source of things changing to allow the outcomes to be different. The kid didn't change. The kid didn't learn anything. Maybe the kid, maybe now the kid's playing with better players. Maybe they get pushed more at practice. That's certainly a good thing. You certainly want to be model other things, but there's a really, really good chance that you just got more talent and you don't have more of anything else. Not saying that's always the case. But my argument is winners find ways to win. And it's unfortunate in our world today, and especially in youth baseball, winning only means I get the plastic ring at the end. Or, well, I guess they're metal now, but I get the ring at the end of the weekend. That's what winning means. It doesn't mean growth. It doesn't mean improvement. It doesn't mean you work your butt off at practice and, you go from hitting 250 to 350, right? That's not what it means anymore. And so I don't know that we're serving our kids when we take that approach. I think we do better when we work to get kids to take responsibility and ownership of their role in the process, of the things that they control, to help them understand that failure comes with it. It's part of the territory. Help make them aware of their actions and their role in this process, the choices that they make, the good and the bad consequences. A few episodes ago, we talked about, and I've already mentioned it in this one, but it's, what would we expose somebody to shape them into, now we've got this new term, an anti-fragile person. Everybody's heard the term post-traumatic stress, but there's another term, which is post-traumatic growth. This is another one I hadn't come in contact with until reading the Anti-Fragile book, but it's one that I think is interesting to consider because we only typically think about post-traumatic stress. We don't think about when stressful and terrible and awful events actually create growth and people experience improvements as a result of the negative things. We don't think about that. So again, to continue to think about this, if we dive in, if we go in and always change the variables, if we always are the constant reminder for our kids, how are we artificially sheltering them from the things that make them grow? Again, in life, disappointments are going to come. They're going to have a project that bombs. They're going to have a job that they want that they don't get. They're going to have difficulties. They're going to have relationships that blow up. It's part of the human experience. Real life stuff, in other words. So I've also, in the past several weeks, come across a lot of things, different things related to kids and kids growing up. And only recently, maybe, I don't know, in the last 40 years or so, has our society kind of treated kids like kids until they're like 23 to 25 years old. Now, some of this has come out of, research showing that our brain doesn't fully develop until we're 25. But there's a whole other thing that has come out where basically like kids are not capable of anything and they're incompetent, until they get some life experience under their belt. And that paradigm has really been challenged for me lately via a couple different books that we'll talk about in later episodes. But it's a really interesting thought exercise to go back and look at what kids were subjected to, not 500 years ago. I'm talking about 100 years ago, where kids would quit school at 5th and 6th grade or even before, or never go to school, where their responsibilities were to, work on the farm or take care of animals or do these very challenging physical type things, and do it consistently and do it in a way that in some cases was life or death. And they were capable. We look at the age of our founding fathers. We look at, again, past history and so many young, by our definition now, very young people in chronological age doing amazing and unbelievable things. And yet now we say, well, they're not adults till they're 25. I need to protect them and shelter them and all that good stuff. And I just don't know that that's true. So here's the takeaway as I wrap this up. If you are going to insulate your kids from failure, just do so with clear thinking and an understanding of why. Make sure that it's not destructive empathy, where we care so much about their feelings and how they're feeling in the moment and the emotions that we protect them, or that we do so in an attempt to protect our own ego, right? So others think of us as great parents and great parents in this context. So just making sure we understand why, understand those things. And when we, push our kids and challenge our kids, make sure we're doing it for their benefit and not ours. And as long as I am making noise on this microphone in the form of a podcast, I want to emphasize, I'm not here to tell you how to do it. I don't know that that works under most circumstances anyway, but I am here to help you work through the same things that I work through as a parent, to be thoughtful about your approach, to maybe think of things in a different way and through a different lens. And at the end of the day, my ultimate hope for you, for your child, is that you get what you want. And so I hope that this gives you a thought process to look at failure a little bit differently, to look at your involvement with your kids and the things that they may succeed or fail at a little bit differently, and just challenge your thinking. And maybe you don't change a thing. Maybe you don't. But at least you have thought through what you're trying to accomplish and why you're doing what you're doing. And as always, keep what's useful, disregard the rest. If you are enjoying the podcast, share it with a friend. Maybe at least it'll get some conversation going. Who is this lunatic that says you should let your kids fail? At any rate, share it with somebody. That's really how it's going to grow. We don't, push this out anywhere. So you're the only way we grow. So if you are enjoying it, if you're getting something out of it, shoot an episode to somebody and share it with them. Follow us, subscribe on the different platforms. Check out our social media accounts. The website is live. That is askingforknowledge.com. So you can go there and check out the different things that we offer. You can also go there and participate in our surveys. So there is a link there for surveys. We want to hear your feedback as to what your experiences are in youth baseball or in other areas of life. So please share that with us. And until next time, keep asking for knowledge.